This is the Carlinian Studio, and I'm your host, Charles Lathrop, and today I'm going to talk to you guys about the laws of logic and the nature of God, and how these two concepts are inextricably linked with each other. Now, when God introduces himself to Moses, when Moses asks, "Who should I say sent me?" God says, "I am. Tell them the I am has sent you, because I am that I am." Now, here we see in these two words, I am, the whole foundation of logic and philosophy in the modern world. Now, I'm not going to directly get into postmodernism and all the rest of that nonsense just yet, but for the sake of understanding the laws of logic, we know this is where it comes from. It's from God. All right? The first law of logic is a law of identity. A thing is the same unto itself. It is the same in nature with itself. It doesn't have two natures simultaneously. It doesn't have two contradictory natures. All right? So God is who he is. He's not Shiva. He's not Allah. He's not Buddha. All right? Yahweh is Yahweh. He is the same in nature to himself. All right? All religions cannot be true because it defies reason. It defies the fundamental fabric of the universe. And you might be inclined to say, oh, well, we can just get rid of the law of identity. But the thing about the laws of logic is that if you try to get rid of them, you find that you have to assume them. So you're trying to disprove the law of identity. Well, in order to disprove the law of identity, you have to nail down that the law of identity is what you're disproving. And that it's the law of identity you're disproving and not some other thing that you're disproving. So if you don't have the law of identity, then how do you know that you're not disproving the law of gravity? If you don't have the law of identity, then how do you know you're not disproving, literally anything else? In order to hold the law of identity down long enough to disprove it, you have to have the law of identity so that you know what you're talking about is the law of identity and not something else. And so you can't prove it, but as soon as you try to disprove it, you have to keep it too. The second rule of logic is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction simply states that for any item, for anything, it has a property A. It cannot have property A and also not A at the same time and in the same way. And so, for example, if we take temperature as an example, I could say, well, this room is hot. Now, relative to what I would prefer, that's a true statement. This room is hot. But relative to the surface of the sun, it's not hot. And you might say, well, we got rid of the law of non-contradiction. That's contradictory. Well, see, the thing about that is it cannot have the same property. It cannot have contradictory properties at the same time and in the same way. And so, over time, the temperature of the room may change quite a bit. And then, at one point in time, right now, it has to be, the properties cannot be contradictory in the same way. It cannot have two contradictory properties that are, the same type of property. And so, that's why it's important to understand that whenever I say it's hot, that doesn't contradict saying it's cold, depending on what the relative situation is. So if you say it's relatively cold to the sun, that's not contradicting me saying it's relatively relatively hot to what I would prefer. So it's not contradicting. It's not contradictory, because it's one property at one point in time in one particular way. So you can't play with semantics to try and avoid this. You can't say, oh, well, this table here is an elephant. It's like, no, it's a table, okay? You can use the word elephant. You can make the sounds that produce the word elephant, but the table's physical matter remains. It is in the shape of a table. It is of the atoms it's made up of. It is not something else other than what it is. It is the same in essence to itself, and it doesn't have multiple contradictory properties at the same time and in the same way. And so God, it is often said God is good, or God is love, or God is light, etc. ad nauseum. And this is God is good all the time. And so the claim is God is good in all times and in all ways. So if you're going to say that God is good in all times and all ways, you cannot say that he is simultaneously not good at any time and in any way. You can't say that Yahweh is good in this way and then in this other context or in this other way he's not, and have them be at the same time and in the same way. And similar to the law of identity, if you try to get rid of the law of non-contradiction, you find yourself having to assume it. And so you say, okay, well, let's get rid of the law of non-contradiction. Well, since we don't have to worry about contradicting ourselves, we can also keep the law of non-contradiction. And in order to say that the law of non-contradiction is gone, we have to say that it is absolutely true that it is gone. Which means that we're saying there is no contradiction in that it is gone 100%. Therefore, it is not contradictory for it to also be here. And so you find yourself in a situation where, in order for this to work, you have to tolerate something that defeats your own argument. Whenever you try to get rid of the law of non-contradiction, you're effectively saying that it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter if you get rid of it or not, because it's always something that you're going to need in order to fully get rid of it. You're always going to need to say there is no contradiction in order to debunk non-contradiction. Now, the third law of logic is the law of the excluded middle. And so for any one-part proposition, it is either true or false and not something in between. And so if I say, using the example earlier, this room is hot relative to what I prefer, that would be either true or false. It is not something in between. That's just a one-part proposition. If I say, my name is Charles Lathrop, all right, that's either true or false. It is not something in between. There's the middle is excluded. It is the law of the excluded middle. And similar to God, he is God for everyone, or he is not God for anyone. It is true that he is God, or it is false that he is God. He can't be God for me and not God for other people. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with the fabric of reality. And we see this in the I am, the statement I am, that I am. So if you try to get rid of the law of the excluded middle, then you find that you also get to keep it. It also stays around, because if you're trying to say that it is false, absolutely false, then you have to say that the middle is excluded. But if you're trying to disprove the existence of the law of the excluded middle, then you have to have a middle. And if you have to have a middle, then you can't say that the law of the excluded middle is absolutely false. It's like whenever Obi-Wan Kenobi says in Star Wars, only the Sith deal in absolutes. Really? Is he absolutely certain of that? It just doesn't make any sense. Once you actually start digging into a lot of modern philosophy and modern thinking and, postmodernism, it doesn't make any sense. And so most postmodernism is, it's fundamentally based on the idea that there is no objective truth, there's no objective reality. Everything is dependent on your own individual interpretations. And this is often kind of grows out of literature to a certain extent, or maybe it grew into literature. But where I most came into contact with this was in literature, in the concept of the death of the author, and sort of like everybody brings their own interpretations, and there's no particular narrative except for the narrative that you bring to the world and to your life. And so everything is kind of meaningless, and you bring the meaning that you have to it. And language, It's just words defined by other words, and there's no fundamental reality supporting it all. There's no objective truth really anywhere, and everything is just dependent on your personal perspective. And the thing about that is that in order for that to be true, you can't communicate it with anyone. Because as soon as I start using words to communicate the concept of the death of the author to you, if you comprehend the death of the author, then you don't have to believe anything I say the way that I said it. Because as soon as the sounds come out of my mouth, you can reinterpret it any way you want to. So communication just completely breaks down. Now, I understand that whenever it comes to, really artistic things like poems and songs and whatever, it is frequently the case that the artists or authors, in certain cases, expect their readers to basically come up with their own interpretations. That's the point of the piece, or it's the point of the work. I understand that. But in terms of actual philosophy, okay, that doesn't make any sense. All right, it makes no sense at all, and it would totally break down social interaction of any kind if people actually believed this. Because literally, if I want to communicate at all, we have to agree on what words mean. And it's not the sounds that are coming out of my mouth that are the point. It's the meanings that are the point. If the meanings are coming through and you're understanding what I'm meaning, then the sounds are arbitrary. Now, saying that the sounds are arbitrary is not the same as saying that the meanings are arbitrary. Saying that the words are arbitrary is not the same as saying that the meanings of the words are arbitrary. Saying that the words can only be defined by other words is entirely missing the point of language itself as a cultural institution of human beings. All right? There are meanings everywhere in the world all the time. All right? If anything exists, something has to have a meaning. If anything exists and I want to communicate to you about it, then I can make, arbitrary symbols or arbitrary sounds in order to communicate the meanings that I want to communicate to you, in order for us to have a dialogue about the world or about human nature or whatever, whatever you want. But the arbitrariness of the sounds and the arbitrariness of the symbols does not translate into making the meanings themselves arbitrary, or the meanings themselves purely assigned by the interpreter or the observer or the reader. And so if you take something like a law or the Constitution or what have you, if you apply death of the author to something where the meaning was very intentionally supposed to be one thing, you're not interpreting that in a new way. You're just interpreting it wrongly, okay? You're just misinterpreting it, okay? You're not bringing something new to it. You're just not interpreting it correctly. If I'm talking into the camera right now and somebody comes away from everything that I'm saying with, the idea that postmodernism, I think postmodernism is fantastic and it's great, okay? That's not your interpretation of what I'm saying. That's a misinterpretation of what I'm saying. Now, you may think that postmodernism is great, but if you come away with the idea that I think it is too, you have wildly misinterpreted what I said, all right? So you can't say the meanings are arbitrary, all right? Or that you can bring whatever narrative you want to any given situation. Because whenever I am trying to communicate to you, the words that I have coming out of my mouth are meant to accomplish a specific thing, to communicate specific things, to communicate specific messages and specific meanings. All right? If that communication doesn't happen, language is useless. So if I say to you, there is no objective truth, well, there's no reason for you to interpret from what I said any meaning. You don't have to believe that there's objective truth or not objective truth. Because if there is no objective truth, then my words have no meaning. And if my words have no meaning, and you can just assign whatever the heck meaning you want to, then whenever I say there's no objective truth, you can say, oh, well, there is objective truth. And you'll be perfectly valid according to my own point of view. And so you find, whenever you talk about the laws of logic, if you try to get rid of them, you have to keep them too. You know, if you try to say only a Sith deals in absolutes, then you have to keep absolutes. You have to have absolutes in order for that sentence to even make sense. In order to get rid of the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction or the law of excluded middle, you have to keep them. Or you end up creating a situation where they are definitely included. And in order to believe that there's no objective truth, that meaning is arbitrary, you have to live in a world where there's no possibility of ever communicating that with anyone else. It's a self-defeating proposition. In order for postmodernism to make sense, you have to get rid of it. In order for it to survive, it has to destroy itself. It must implode because it is its own nature to implode on itself, because it doesn't make any sense. It has no internal consistency or structure at all. And so whenever God says, I am light, or whenever God says, Jesus says, I am the way of the truth and the life, I've come to give you life and life more abundant. All right. His way is life. He's the fountain of facthood. He is the definer of identity, non-contradiction, the excluded middle, basic fundamental building blocks of logic and the fabric of the universe. And then if you reject that and then you go over into postmodernism and you embrace an ideology where it must inherently implode upon itself, all right, you find that what you've embraced is a philosophy of death, which is exactly what communism and secularism has always produced, is death. Now, it varies in times and place, but fundamentally, whenever these kinds of postmodernists, communist, Marxist ideologies take hold, what they produce is decline and destruction and decay and death. And they have killed millions and millions of people all over the world, in Cambodia and China and all over Africa and Russia and dozens of other places. And it's inevitable. It's inevitable because that's the way that the argument itself works at the most basic level. At its most basic, fundamental building block level, postmodernism is inherently self-destructive. It has to be, because it rejects the idea of facthood. So it rejects the very thing that would even allow itself to exist in the first place. This has been the Carlinian Studio, and I am your host, Charles Lathrop, and God bless.